Hi everyone, Fresh here. I'm here to talk to you about the 2.5x Prism from Primary Arms, a certified hood classic. Aside from their now defunct 4X, this 2.5x Prism is one of the oldest ones in Primary Arms' lineup. Evidently, it's also one of their least expensive. That doesn't mean, however, that it isn't action-packed with a lot of different hidden features. Let's first take a look at how it stacks up against some potential competitors. Due to the recent price fluctuations of this model, I'm going to pair the 2.5X with a limited set of Gen 1, Gen 2, and some Gen 3 battle prisms, as well as some budget options from Amazon specials such as Monstrum. Since there's no available option that you could purchase that's at 2.5x, we're going to straddle around that magnification in the 3x and 2x regions. In a sense, what do you lose by going down magnification 20% to a 2x? Or what do you gain by going up in magnification by only going up by 16%? Listed are the typical exit pupils that you should see in this particular segment. In terms of field of view, our 2.5x comes in at 37.5 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 93.8. If we wanted a basis of comparison for this, most new LPVOs will be at a norm score of 100 and above. However, this matches up quite nicely to the likes of the Trigicon TRS-24, which is another 1-4 LPVO that we've looked at in some of these comparisons before. And I would say this norm score is pretty respectable. For those wondering if 2.5x is too high of a magnification, let's see what happens when you reduce that magnification by about 20%. Down to our Primary Arms GLX 2X. You do gain some field of view, bringing you up to 42 feet at 100 yards, but you lose some norm FOV in the process, giving a norm score of 84 dead flat. If we were to be honest with ourselves, this isn't that much better than the Primary Arms 1X microprism, which is meant to be used a little bit more like a red dot. Because everyone's eyes are different, field of view isn't exactly everything. So let's keep on going here. Now, what would happen if we need to go a little bit up in magnification? Perhaps about 16%, up to a 3x. What would be the second generation of Primary Arms' battle prisms, even though they call them the Gen 3, is the SLX 3X prism. This boasts a respectable field of view of 31 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 94.5, almost matching the SLX 2.5x. In this sense, the 2.5x still seems to hold its own against slightly newer products. With the advent of Primary Arms' new microprism line, the 3X microprism SLX is a formidable contender here in field of view, with a rating of 38 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 114, which is up there with some high-end LPVOs in terms of the size of the sight picture that you perceive. Since the aforementioned prisms here are anywhere from $50 to $100 more expensive than the 2.5x retails for now, let's go for some cheaper options and see what they offer us. These 5 prisms from Monstrum, ranging anywhere from 2 to 3x, may offer some optical clarity for a decent price. The Marksman 2X has a field of view of 44.3 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 88.6. Really not that much better than the 2.5x, or even the GLX 2X in this case. The Monstrum 3x30 Compact yields a field of view of 39.3 at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 117.9, which is quite large, even compared to the 3X microprism for Primary Arms. Monstrum's self-titled 3x30 microprism also comes in at a field of view of 37.2 at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 111.6. The Raven, with a slightly larger objective of 32 millimeters, comes in at a field of view of 39.3 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 117.9. Very similar to the 3x30 Compact. And finally, the Monstrum Blackbird 3x30 prism comes in at a field of view of 30.1 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 90.3. This being higher end, I would have expected it to do a little bit better than our 2.5x. In the field of view department, Primary Arms again comes under a very stiff competition. What do we think here about eye relief? Our 2.5x comes in at a rated eye relief of 2.7 inches, but can be used as far as 3 inches. The 2X GLX comes in at a fairly generous 3.5 inches of eye relief, which is close to how some LPVOs might act. Both of our SLX 3X prisms, both the regular and micro prism, also come in at a field of view range between 2.7 and 2.9 inches. The Marksman 2X and the 3x30 microprism from Monstrum come in at an extremely generous 5.5 inches. Monstrum's 3x30 Compact, the Raven 3x32, and the Blackbird 3x30 are closer to LPVO territory at 3.5 inches of eye relief. In terms of overall optic length, things get a little bit interesting here as well. Our 2.5x is roughly the same dimensions as an ACOG TA31 at 4.8 inches in length. Our GLX, for some reason, ends up being just a little bit longer at 5.3 inches. The regular SLX 3X is about 4.7. The SLX 3X microprism is at an extremely short 3 inches. And Monstrum's first third compact line is at about 4 inches in length. And the Raven and Blackbird 3Xs are at both 5.0 and 5.1 inches, respectively. A rather heavy consideration here also is the weight of the optical package. Our 2.5X weighs in at 14.7 ounces. Our very small and svelte GLX 2X is at about 11 ounces dead. Our rather porky SLX 3X is at about 18.4 ounces. And our ultra-compact SLX 3X microprism is at a dead 8 ounces. Monstrum's Marksman 2X and 3x30 microprism are at a still svelte 11 ounces in weight. The 3x30 not-so-compact is at about 17 ounces. Monstrum's Raven and Blackbird are a little bit closer in weight to our 2.5X at 14.5 and 14 inches for the Raven and Blackbird, respectively. Add about an ounce or two to these packages for a piggyback mount and something simple like a Holosun 407C, and you get the following weights. Now, the 2.5X seems to hold its own against a lot of the other prisms, even though it's not perfect. Now, let's try and see here how a wildcard might be able to knock this 2.5X off its comfortable kilter. We can try a combination of our 1X SLX microprism plus the Vortex Micro 3X magnifier. This gives a similar exit pupil, a field of view that is somewhat similar to the 3X microprism at 38.2 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 114.6, quite competitive in this group. A somewhat similar eye relief, however tighter range than the 2.5X, giving us a much larger length on the upper receiver in exchange for having a similar weight and the capability of utilizing a true 1X whenever we want to. This, in a sense, becomes the very definition of the comparison between a red dot and magnifier combo and a conventional fixed power prism. Do you want the availability of a true 1X? Yes, but it'll cost you some overall length and therefore some lost space for the availability of accessories on your upper receiver. In the meantime, your field of view and weight may not change all that much, but you may lose a little bit of eye box and eye relief flexibility. We can add two specific metrics here. I call them mag length and mag weight. It's simply the amount of magnification per unit length and the amount of magnification you get per unit weight. This just gives you an idea of capability per dimension. With these calculated out, our SLX 2.5 prism performs at about the bottom of the pack, and our 3X SLX microprism is right up top. An extremely small prism with a lot of magnification. In terms of magnification per unit weight, the 3X microprism comes out on top again at a ratio of 0.38, leaving our 2.5X second from the bottom yet again. If we utilize a similar pseudo-scoring system that we did with the couple last reviews, we end up with the 3x30 microprism from Monstrum and our primary arms microprism both at the top in terms of their scores, and our 2.5X is a little bit towards the bottom. So upon a cursory glance on paper, this optic may seem like it's a little long in the tooth or slightly underspec'd in a couple of ways, but I think it's worth taking a look at a few details to see why this thing has stood the test of time on Primary Arms' lineup. If we take a look at this optic itself, it's kind of modeled a little bit like the ACOG TA31. I think there's a good reason for that. The original 4X that this particular body is built off of is designed, well, probably was, that design has been probably commissioned by DS Arms right now, or the licensing at least was given to them. But the original one was a 4X, and I believe that one was meant to be a competitor for the TA31 originally. I think this is something that came out probably in 2011, 2012. I might be getting the year wrong, so I'll just kind of post it here. But I believe that was meant to be a competitor with slightly longer eye relief, a slightly smaller field of view, but maintaining some good deal of mechanical integrity at a slightly lower price. And I think when that model didn't quite turn out too well with sales, they decided to dial back the magnification for a slightly different use. And I think this 2.5x magnification ends up working pretty well. The reticle itself has great illumination settings in the daytime. We'll check out the NV here later on in this video, but it looks to be that this has about 11 daytime settings and a 0 position on this turn. It's pretty tactile, a little bit old school, kind of like a Gen 1 battle prism, but you could definitely feel the clicks, and there isn't a whole lot of mush in between the clicks itself. This feels very solid to me. If you look at these turrets, they're not quite exposed, but they do stick out just a little bit. Again, it's kind of old school. This style, again, with old school battle prisms, you see these little caps. There is an O-ring on the bottom that these do seal with, so I don't have any doubt about the water resistance, at least on these mechanical turrets. They have a little brass ring right here that is threaded for these aluminum caps, and a basically a threaded brass screw used for windage and elevation adjustments. This is kind of the old school way, so you could probably do this with a penny, like some of their optics. That's what's kind of nice. It does look like a cartridge could fit there. The rim could fit there on the cartridge, or a screw or a penny, and adjust quite easily. I did do a little bit of shooting with this, and the clicks were, positive enough that I didn't feel like I was getting a false zero or false correction adjustment for point of impact. If you look at the scope eye, this thing looks extremely durable. It actually looks maybe even slightly overbuilt, which is something that I like feel-wise when I'm looking at a prism like this, especially this size, especially as low of magnification as it does have for this size as well. I know I'm going to harp on that a little in this video. This mount looks fairly durable. Might be equally as good as the TA31 ACOG. These screws look pretty beefy. You have the option of using a screw tool or a basic hex socket. I forgot the size. I will post that over here. That seems to be fine, hand torquing it. I wouldn't recommend grabbing the end of that socket. I would just kind of look at the middle of it, see where it feels like it's starting to tighten up a little bit, leave it there, zero it from there. And if you get it to about that same torque every time, I think you'll be within an inch of your zero every time you take this on and off, as long as you use the same rail section to push the scope in. Another feature that came with the scope, which was a nice touch, these are not exactly the best scope caps, and I don't really know this brand. It's probably something designed by Primary Arms, but it's nice that they included them and they just kind of go onto here. I don't have to buy some extra Butler Creek caps. Even with a little bit more quality for the Butler Creek and the fact that you do have caps that can be sized for this particular scope, I think this gives a better impression of the entire packaging and protecting the front and rear lenses. There's very good glass here, and sometimes it's kind of a shame that the ACOG doesn't have more options in terms of getting glass front and back, especially if you're going to do a piggyback option. And this piggyback option in particular just involves a rail that's sold separately by Primary Arms. It's just a section of Picatinny held by 2 screws that's just kind of cantilevered over the front objective. And then, you could just pick whatever mount that you like. You can get these off of Amazon pretty easily. Just Loctite the screws on both of these and get a nice forward mounting position for your piggyback. And I think this might end up working fine for night vision. We're going to see later on in this video how that goes. This mount here, I'll just kind of put the link where I got it. This is just an acro footprint so that I can accommodate this Steiner MPS up top that you did see on the videos tested before. I'll put the link up here. So far, this looks like a fairly robust package. There's probably one more thing here. I would say Loctite these screws that go into the bottom mount, into the cantilever that's here that's machined, again, much like the ACOG. I'd probably suggest putting your typical blue Loctite anti-vibration type in order for those screws not to loosen up. They have loosened up on me a few times. They don't really happen on the ACOG, but for whatever reason, because of the countersunk screw that was used in this design, I think it has a tendency to slip if it doesn't engage completely, and if isn't some kind of thread lock or anti-vibration compound there. So be on the lookout for that. Some quick logos. These caps do Open up, seems like good quality, and then there's a diopter in the back. It is not quite pictured, but the diopter settings seem flexible enough that most people can look through here. So this is just kind of a quick view of the physical setup of this prism. So it's about the size of an ACOG, but has a lot less magnification and about the same weight. Can you take this peculiar little package to distance? 300 yards is extremely easy with just a center point aim on the reticle, which also happens to be your 50-yard zero due to the arc of the projectile and height over bore. One of the cleverest tricks that this prism has up its sleeve is its ACSS CQB M or M1 reticle. It consists of a large horseshoe on the outside for the CQB portion of this reticle, with a ranging stadia ladder on each side, which shows its age a little bit, but is quite effective. Possesses a leading dot on either side for 8.6 miles per hour from 100 to 300 yards, and a horseshoe dot in the center peppered by a simple dot BDC. The suggested method here is to zero in at 50 yards. Due to height over bore and projectile motion, you should also have that center dot cross at 300 yards. So I suggest truing that center dot at 300 yards after you sight in at 50. What does the rest of this reticle look like with hot M193 at about 3150 feet per second? If we look here, this looks surprisingly precise. We have relatively precise holds for 400, 500, and 600 yards, as stated on the box. If we lose about 50 feet per second, we still get decent holds at 400, 500 yards, with a small sacrifice at 600. If we bring ourselves down to a 14.5 or slightly weaker M193 out of a 16-inch barrel, we're still relatively close to 400 yards, slightly off at 500 yards by about 25, and have a new 550-yard bottom dot. If we have something like a 13.7 or 12.5 yielding us 2,900 feet per second, our first dot crossed at 367 yards, our second one at 450, and our bottom one at 530. There isn't a terrible amount of precision with this zero, so if you adjust it a little bit to something like 55, 60, or even 65 yards, you can have this following corrected reticle, where you can still maintain a 330-yard first dot, close to a 400-yard second dot, and a bottom dot that gives you a nice and comfortable 500 yards. Now what happens if we're down to something like 2,600 feet per second out of a 10.5-inch barrel? If we adjust our zero to about 60 yards, we end up with the following BDC that gives us a great 300-yard hold, a fairly close 400-yard hold, and a comfortable 450-yard hold, which is at about the effective range for 55 grain out of a 10.5-inch barrel. Not bad so far for M193. What if we move to a 62 grain load such as M855? If we assume a velocity of 2975 feet per second out of a 16-inch barrel, we end up with a similar BDC to the first one that we had with M193. We have an easy 400, 500, and 600-yard hold. Since it's more likely that barrel length is going to dictate the velocity of this load, let's see what happens when we go down to our 10.5 Mark 18 again. With just a slight adjustment out to about 65 yards, we end up with a comfortable 300-yard, 400-yard, and almost 500-yard hold on the bottom. So far with your minimum legal length and SBR lengths, this reticle is actually fairly forgiving. What happens if we end up with something like a 20-inch M16 clone? If we take our hot M193 again at about a velocity of 33.25 feet per second, we need to adjust our zero slightly to about 70 yards to get the same crossover pattern at 50 and 300 in the center, a nice 400, a close 500, and an excellent and comfortable 600-yard hold. If we move that distance a little bit closer to the regular mil-spec M193 at about 32.40 feet per second, our reticle doesn't change all that much. Now if we try M855 in the same 20-inch barrel, we end up with something between 3050 and 3100 feet per second on a good day. At this 50-yard zero, we end up with the following BDC. Everything seems to move by a comfortable 30 yards in this case.
I bet you if we move our zero a little bit further, say by 30 yards, we end up with a fairly decent BDC here. And what do you know? We have a decent hold for 400 yards. It says it's about 384. An excellent hold at 500, and a comfortable, nearly dead 601 yards on the bottom dot. The fact that you could take such a simple reticle, move your zero by rather predictable and tractable increments up and down to get your precise zero, and with decent velocities go from 0 to 300 yards without having any kind of holdovers, makes this one of the best reticles that I've ever tested so far. I guarantee you that at any reasonable velocity and reasonable optic height, that you're going to find a 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 3 solution for this BDC.
The glass is also extremely clear at this magnification. Not that you'd be able to tell, especially with this particular object magnification size. But I would dare say it's a little bit clearer than the 3x prisms that I've seen so far. Not only is this thing extremely fast in the short range, but it happens to acquire and engage targets very quickly, easily out to 500, maybe even 600 yards. It may even look a little bit goofy with this Steiner MPS piggybacked on top, but this is nearly the perfect position possible for night vision.
And night vision capability it has. Because if you use passive aiming, you end up with your Steiner NPS with the Picatinny mount, Amazon Picatinny adapter, and the center line of your optic being about 4.85 to 5 inches over bore. Now this might seem like a stretch, but I'm able to use this piggyback quite well with a decent chin weld without too much of a fuss. This is a pretty decent position for a PVS-14, and it doesn't hit the illumination or optical bell of the scope. For passive aiming through a piggyback dot, you are just about fine. The problem really comes in if you try to use the magnified portion of the system for night vision. You have a bloomy mess that is really not all that good for your tubes, which kind of makes sense and shows the age of this prism again, because when this prism came out, there weren't a whole lot of magnified scopes that had night vision capabilities or night vision illumination settings. Setting number 1 is somewhat daylight bright in a lot of conditions, and therefore it is always going to be too bright, even with a aperture adjustable system on your monocular. And that's just the way it is. And it's kind of unfortunate, because with a little bit of this magnification and the amount of light transmission I feel like I'm getting, this could have been a contender for a decent magnified optic. If you're going to create a GPR out of this optic, make sure you have the front piggyback solution of some sort.
So at the end of the day, what do I think of this thing? I actually think that this is an even cheaper alternative, surprisingly, to the Vortex 5X as a do-it-all optic. It's about $100 cheaper, can engage targets fairly easy up out to 500, maybe even 600 yards if your eyes are good. With or without a piggyback, is able to engage short-range targets very well, and does so in a sub-$200 package, and it weighs about 14.7 to 15 ounces. It appears with this current construction, however outdated it may be, seems to be one of the most durable budget optics that I've ever tried out. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know at this point if some of these are still for sale. Last time I checked on Primary Arms, they sold I think for about $99, but they were out of stock, which may or may not be the signal for the 5X Prism coming in for reviewers and consumers alike. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the range.